You have learned how to create new types using classes. Now there is a tiny problem in this implementation. We can create a point object without an x or y coordinates. Let me show you. So point, we create this object here, and before we set point.x, let's print point.x. Run our program. We get this attribute error that you saw in the last tutorial. So point object has no attribute called x. This is the problem we have here. It is possible to have a point object without an x or y coordinates. And that doesn't really make sense because whenever we talk about a point, we need to know where that point is located. To solve this problem, we use a constructor. A constructor is a function that gets called at the time of creating an object. So here on line 9, when creating this point object, we want to pass values for x and y coordinates, let's say 10 and 20. And with this point object that we get here will have its x and y coordinates initialized. So how do we do this? We need to add a special method in this class called constructor. So on the top, we define a new function. Look at the name of this function, $init $. So init is short for initialize. And this is the function or the method that gets called when we create a new point object. Now, press enter. So this automatically adds self in parentheses. We're going to come back to this shortly. Now, right after self, we want to add two extra parameters, x and y. So let's type out x and y. And then in the body of this method, we should read the values passed here and use them to initialize our object. So when we pass 10 and 20, these arguments will be used for x and y parameters. Now to initialize our object, we type out code like this, self.x equals x, and then self.y equals y. What is going on here? This self that you see here is a reference to the current object. So back to line 13, when we create a new point object, self references that object in memory, the same object that we are referencing using this variable. So earlier we typed point.x equals 10. With this code, we set the x attribute of this point object. Now what we have in the constructor is exactly the same. We're using self to reference the current object, and then we set the x attribute to the x argument passed to this function. So using this init method, we can initialize our objects, and we refer to this method as a constructor. This method is used to construct or create an object. Okay, so now let's remove line 14. So we create a point object with these values and then print point.x. Let's run our program. There you go. X is 10. We can also change these values later. So just before printing point.x, we can set point.x to 11 and then run our program. So x is updated. Beautiful. All right, here's an exercise for you. I want you to define a new type called person. These person objects should have a name attribute as well as a talk method. This is a very easy exercise, so you can tackle it in probably a couple of minutes. All right, so first we start with the class keyword. We define this person class. Once again, look at the naming convention I have used here. The first letter of the first word, in this case, the only word, is uppercase. Now, in this class, we define all the methods that we need. Currently, we have only one method, that is the talk method. So define talk. PyCharm automatically adds self. We come back to this shortly. For now, let's just print talk. So this is the body of our person class. We remove the indentation and add two line breaks after defining our classes. Now we can create a person object. Let's call that John. We set it to person. We can call John.talk. Let's run the program. So we get this message, beautiful. But our person objects should also have a name attribute. It doesn't make sense to have a person without a name. So that is when we use the constructor function. So on the top, we add a new method. The name of this method is _init _. So we call this method a constructor. Now, in this method, we need to add another parameter that is name. So we simply set self.name to name. Once again, self references the current object, so we're setting the name attribute of the current object to the name argument passed to this method. With this, we can go back to line 9, and when creating a person object, we pass the name, let's say John Smith. Now, let's print john.name and run our program. There you go. So John Smith is printed on the terminal. Beautiful. So this is all you had to do as part of this exercise. But let's make this program a little bit more interesting. Instead of printing this boring message here, let's print, "Hi, I am John Smith." So we can use a formatted string with a message like, "Hi, I am." Now we want to dynamically add the name of this person. How do we do that? Well, look at the parameter of this talk method. As I told you before, every method in our class should have this parameter, self. And this should be the very first parameter of every method. Okay? So with this self, we can get reference to the current object. So we can add curly braces and type out self.name. This returns the name attribute of the current person object. With this, we can remove line 10, where we print john.name, and simply call john.talk. Let's run our program. "Hi, I am John Smith." Beautiful. Now we can create another person object. Let's say Bob is a new person called Bob Smith. When we say bob.talk and run our program, we get a different message. "Hi, I'm Bob Smith." So each object is a different instance of a person class.